Well, David, Vladimir Putin made the comments during a meeting with the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe about the ongoing crisis in Ukraine. He also said that Moscow had withdrawn troops from the border. However, a NATO military official says that they've seen no sign of this and they've urged Russia to withdraw them. Well, let's cross live now to Paul Brennan, who is in Donetsk. So, Paul, the government in Kiev refers to these comments by President Putin as hot air. What about the pro-Russia separatists, if we're going to call them that, in eastern Ukraine? What reaction has there been there to these comments?
This announcement by President Vladimir Putin has taken everybody by surprise. The Ukrainian government in Kiev, the separatists here, the media, nobody expected this. It came from talks that he'd had with the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, in Moscow. And frankly, the separatists here have been caught unawares. They were relying on Russian support in order to go ahead with this referendum that they were planning on well, this weekend, May the 11th, and frankly, it came as a shock to them, this announcement from Moscow.
We call on the representatives of southeastern Ukraine, the supporters of the federalization of the country, to postpone the referendum planned for May 11th this year. But a necessary condition for the start of this dialogue is the unconditional stopping of any violence. The planned presidential elections in Kiev are a move in the right direction, but they won't solve anything if all the citizens of Ukraine don't understand how their rights will be guaranteed after these elections are held.
This is not just a subtle position change by the Russian president. To call the elections on May 25th in Kiev a step in the right direction is fundamentally different to what he's been saying before. He called the May 25th election absurd previously. Now, obviously, the reaction here in Donetsk, where the Donetsk People's Republic, as they've styled themselves, has been, well, surprise. I have, in the last hour, been to meet Denis Pushilin. Now, he is the self-declared governor or chairman of the People's Council here in Donetsk. Inside his heavily armed headquarters, he's taken over the city administration building here. Frankly, what he said was that Mr. Putin is not the president of the Donetsk People's Republic. He said the People's Republic will meet tomorrow, Thursday, in order to take a decision. They respected Mr. Putin's opinion, but they weren't necessarily bound by it. That said, it was clear that he wasn't particularly comfortable with the situation he'd been put in.
What does it mean, supporting or not supporting? He didn't say we make some wrong decisions. He knows what we stand against. Even if the majority will decide to postpone the referendum, this will be for no longer than a week. Because later, there will be, on the 25th, attempts to have those so-called elections, so it will get legitimized somewhere, somehow. We intend not to participate in the so-called presidential elections.
So, Paul, a pretty confusing picture for all concerned. Do we know then if there is going to be a referendum over the weekend, or are they just going to decide that tomorrow?
Well, they say they're going to decide that tomorrow. I think it's a face-saving exercise just to delay the inevitable, I think. There's not going to be a referendum this weekend. I just simply can't believe it's going to happen. We were in Luhansk, which is further east from here in Donetsk today, and then we returned to Donetsk during the afternoon. But in Luhansk, we could find nobody. We were going around the streets, talking to people. We spoke to members of the administration there. Nobody knew exactly where they were going to vote, where the ballot boxes were going to be positioned. There simply wasn't the organization there. And I think it was bowing to the inevitable that this referendum that was planned for the East was going to have to be put off, if not abandoned altogether.
Paul Brennan with the latest there from Donetsk. Paul, thank you. And for more on this, we're joined in the studio by the Russia and Eastern Europe specialist, Ben Judah. Thank you so much for joining us here on Al Jazeera. So, painted quite a confusing picture there from Eastern Ukraine and the government in Kiev. What do you think could be behind Putin's comments?
I think it's very important to make it very clear at a moment in which everybody is pretending to be a Putinologist who knows what Putin's strategy is, that when you speak to Russian diplomats and you speak to people in Putin's court, what they say is that Putin isn't talking to anybody, and that Putin is closed. Nobody in Russian high finance knows what Putin is about to do, and that's what makes it so frightening. I think the second thing that we have to remember is don't trust Vladimir Putin. Is that over the last 2 months, Putin said he would never interfere in Ukrainian politics, he would never send troops into Crimea, he would never annex Crimea, he would never destabilise eastern Ukraine, and that this statement, why should we treat it as any different from previous statements?
Because I suppose this is, could we say, the first time that we hear such a conciliatory tone since things have gotten so much worse in the past few weeks?
No, he's made conciliatory statements like this before, but let's just have a look at one of the trends we've seen in the way Putin has dealt with Ukraine, which is to raise Russia's demands to such astronomical heights that a tiny drop looks like a compromise. And in saying that maybe, after all, the elections in Ukraine could go ahead, this leaves Western diplomats so satisfied and indeed grateful to Mr. Putin that the annexation of Crimea and the de facto passing of control of power in Donetsk and in Luhansk and elsewhere to pro-Russian and Russian-funded groups seems like not a very serious demand and one they can live with.
Although, of course, the government in Kiev perhaps isn't aligned like that, because they are saying it's all a bunch of hot air. Really.
Well, the government in Kiev is totally financially dependent on the West. And when the government in Kiev would collapse in 5 minutes if American financial loans were withdrawn and IMF support was withdrawn and EU financial support was withdrawn. So when Putin says that the West is the paymaster of the government in Kiev, he's correct. And nobody knows that better than those in the chancelleries in Kiev itself.
And Judah, we're going to have to leave it there. Russia and Eastern Europe specialist, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.